Okay, example 1 says that ray AM bisects angle FAD. If a ray bisects an angle, it divides it into two congruent angles. So we're going to set those two angles equal to each other. So our equation would be x plus 15 is equal to y. Now unfortunately we can't solve this equation because it has two variables. So let's look at the second diagram. We can assume PQR is a straight angle, which means it adds to 180 degrees. So if I add those two angle measures together, they have to add to 180. So my second equation is 2y plus 3x equals 180. Now I'd like you to please pause the video at this moment and try to solve this system of equations. Then, when you're ready, press play to check your answer. Pause now. Okay, you should have been able to solve this equation and get x equals 30, but it wants you to find the measure of angle RQS. So make sure you take that 3 and multiply it by 30. You have to plug it into the 3x. So 3 times 30 is 90 degrees. Now looking at example 2, we're given that PS is divided by points Q and R in a ratio of 7 to 4 to 3. So remember, for ratio problems, you have to label the diagram with an X. So PQ would be 7X, QR would be 4X, and RS would be 3X. We are also given that PS is equal to 84. So that's going to help us set up an equation. We know that 7X plus 4X plus 3x must equal the entire segment, which is 84. So now I'd like you to pause the video and see if you can solve for x and then answer the two questions below. Pause the video now. Okay, you should have solved to get x equals 6, and then when you plug it in to find the measure of PR, you get 66, since 7x plus 4x is 11x. Then plug in 6 to each of the corresponding segments to determine if Q is the midpoint. And since 24 plus 18 is equal to 42, Q does divide the segment exactly in half. So yes, Q is the midpoint of segment PS. Example 3 is an example of a two-column proof using one of our new vocabulary words. So we are given that B is the midpoint of AC. So B, point B, here on my diagram, is the midpoint of this entire segment AC. So if we think of our definition of a midpoint divides a segment into two congruent segments. So therefore, the conclusion that we can make from that one given is that segment AB is congruent to segment BC. So notice that the first thing I did in my proof is I copied down my given, B is the midpoint of AC, given, and then I could go straight to my conclusion and say that segment AB is congruent to segment BC. Now be careful of the wording because you have to have it worded correctly, otherwise it is wrong. Even if you have the reverse of it, it is still wrong. So since we're starting with a midpoint, that's how we need to start the first part of our statement. So we're going to start with if a point is the midpoint of a segment, since that was given. Then what are we trying to prove? The second thing that we're trying to prove is that we have two congruent segments. So then the second part of our statement needs to say, then it divides it into two congruent segments. It has to be worded exactly like this because we are going from saying a point is a midpoint to saying that we have two congruent segments. So that's how we're using that new vocabulary word, that definition. So please, please, please be careful of the order that you write it in. Look at what you're given, look at what you're trying to prove. That's the most important part of coming up with these statements. Check your answer to example 4. Statement number 1 should be your given. Angle OPS is congruent to angle RPS. Then you can go straight to your conclusion and say that ray PS bisects angle RPO because if a ray divides an angle into two congruent angles, then it bisects the angle. Notice I started with the two congruent angles and then I ended with it bisects the angle.